No Far Cry 4 video or even discussion can escape the success of Far Cry 3. After all, according to fans, remaking Far Cry 3 is all the series has done for over a decade now. But is that really true? If you've played the games, then the answer is no. But it's interesting to see both how wildly different yet familiar Far Cry 4 is compared to its predecessor. Far Cry 4 overhauls a lot of systems, introduces a far more vibrant and interesting location, and yet, mechanically, remains the same. When creating a sequel, it's important to make the game feel new and to feel iterative. But why would the game stray too far from what previously garnered so much success and praise? It's true. There are many moments here that feel as though Ubisoft said, hey, remember that awesome scene from Far Cry 3? Here, do it again. But I think looking at Ubisoft through a modern lens shows us that while some may mock the series for not changing enough, is that so bad when Far Cry Sibling has been in a decade-long identity crisis, with its two fanbases divorced and desperately arguing for custody of the term real Assassin's Creed game? Hard to say, but what is less so is to sing the praises and admittedly mumble the criticisms of Far Cry 4. It's a great game with some minor issues holding it back from being perfect. Some might even say it's better than Far Cry 3, but I don't want to get too crazy, hermano. At least, not yet. As far as new Far Cry games go, it may not feel exactly new. We play a quiet, stoic protagonist traveling to a foreign land, encountering the main villain who captures us, and once escaping, we team up with the rebels to take back the region. It's par for the course, but it's not exactly as I described. Kyrat, a fictional country in India, is not just home to Ajis and Ajas, but to Ajs too. A large theme I covered in my Far Cry 3 video is the idea of the Rook Islands being a foreign land, something to be conquered by Jason. Kyrat has already been colonized, and while it is an unknown land to us, to Ajay, it's home, making it immediately different from the previous game. Functionally, this still results in radio towers, outposts, and fighting the power, but the context is different. This time, it's morally justified. In Far Cry 3, because Jason and the player had a greater overlap, the game could create an insightful critique of the player by critiquing Jason. Far Cry 4 doesn't have that same luxury, but as quickly as I make that claim, our villain is introduced, our Voss 2.0. Except, he's not. Looking to Pagan as a fill-in for Voss is natural. He's on the cover of the game, just like Voss was, but I think in reality, Pagan is more of a Hoyt figure, the man at the head of the operations. He's evil, but not Voss evil. He doesn't completely revel in the horror, rather, he sees it as a necessity to maintain a life of luxury. Okay, who am I kidding? He enjoys it a little, but he maintains some humanity. A humanity that was all but lost in Hoyt. Okay, so we have a new villain, a new location, a new context for that location, a new story, and overhauled presentation? Well, that certainly makes me uncomfortable calling Far Cry 4 just Far Cry 3 again. And when we compare the facets here to Far Cry 3, I find comfort in calling this a series highlight. The world is gorgeous, its gameplay refined, at times a masterwork, and its vibe, something often hard to quantify, makes Kyrat a location I was, on so many occasions, in awe of. After all these years, after all these Far Cries, it's important to look back to see what the series' strongest points were, and perhaps find where the current game's shit seeds were sown. While its narrative may be weaker than the previous game, in basically every other facet, Far Cry 4 is a worthy sequel, and deserves to be regarded as highly as the third. This is Far Cry 4, 10 years later. Part of what makes this game so fun is that I was able to build a genuine connection to Kyrat. This was achieved by the Rook Islands, but in a different way. Here, Kyrat was a country full of genuine beauty. For all the bloodshed, the country still has a mountainous fence that paints any skyline with a textured crown. It's a wise move to present mountains instead of invisible walls, and what makes it better is that what is contained within is full of life and full of history. Where the Rook Islands contain traces of World War II, Kyrat is left with the results of its colonization. Pagan Min has taken this land, but the footprints of its true people aren't yet washed away. A Chinese-British flag might be painted in the ground, but it impales generations of proof that this isn't Pagan's home. Every home has a story to tell, a religious figure it worships, and each has been impacted by the current war. At its heart is Amida and Sabal. Unfortunately, if you prefer your games to stay divorced from politics, then you'll hate this game because the entire conflict is between two people's vision for the future of Kyrat. One wants to maintain tradition and morals no matter how much harder the fight is, and the other holds long-term survival over those morals and traditions. While one would insist that a mausoleum be protected at all costs, the other already has its contents listed on eBay. This conflict, while not as present, does permeate across the land. Radio hosts will comment on their actions, individuals will have their opinions on matters, and the constant pagan propaganda reminds us that the biggest enemy of Kyrat's future is its opposing leaders' inability to compromise. When discussing the narrative further, it becomes clear that this political conflict isn't very well thought out. Characters will be completely unwilling to compromise on a problem that contains solutions that keep both parties happy. If one party seems too correct in their stance, they're given a small radical action to make sure players aren't too loyal. Fortunately, it doesn't just feel good, it looks good too. Far Cry 4 visually has aged beautifully. Its art style, while not photorealistic, doesn't stop it from being picturesque. This is one of those few games I play where I genuinely stopped and just admired the view. I neglected fast travel more than I usually do because moving around the world, whether by vehicle or wingsuit, had moments of serenity. When you were simply driving up to a radio tower, Robbie Ron and his bongra bangers are in your ear, the sounds of the wildlife, the hum of the engine. I almost forgot about the bloodshed on the horizon. This is also aided by the solid selection of music that seems to be due in large part to the higher budget. It created a good vibe, which isn't exactly the most sophisticated description, but an accurate one nonetheless. Praises from Far Cry 3 carry over. When ascending a radio tower, the height is felt by the sounds of wood creaking under its own weight, the poor balance Ajay has at the top, and the wind that whispers in your ear. It's tantalizing. The way the wildlife interacts with both you and the rest of the world is great, even if it did result in me getting spotted because of it on more than one occasion. I think thematically, the wildlife doesn't play the same role it once did, but in terms of making the player feel as though they're in an unsafe land, it achieves its goals. Kyrat isn't visually threatening. There are villages comprised of good people, homes that look beautiful, and if there wasn't a war, it seems like a rather friendly place, especially when the bright pastels score much of the UI. This would be a problem if we're meant to feel in danger. Basic enemies won't get the job done. For as much as they hit hard and I died plenty of times, a human isn't exactly an intimidating foe. People are predictable. We know how they move and can accurately play around that. Wild animals are exactly that. They'll charge you even at their own detriment, and it gives Kyrat an element of unpredictability that keeps the theoretically repetitive gameplay from being stale. Yeah, just like Far Cry 3, you can approach an encounter with silenced weapons, but no other game lets you ride in on an elephant while shooting a rocket launcher. No other game has a rhino throw a car at me, and yeah, it might be a little outlandish, but damn if it wasn't a cool moment. The greatest difference between Far Cry 4 and 3 when it comes to the world is the context in which we conquer it. Far Cry 4 to me is the first game where the main objective isn't to survive. In the first game, we're stranded on a tropical island. In the second, it was clear that while we were in Africa to take down the jackal, it wasn't that simple, and thus we were far out of our depth. In 3, we were again stranded, and our primary goal was getting off the island with as many of our friends as we could. 4's primary goal isn't even necessarily killing Pagan, it's finding Lakshmana, a location the locals don't know much about. That's kinda weird. Our concern isn't with Kyrat. Ajay even says as much throughout most of the story.
I'm not involved in whatever this is, I'm just looking for Lakshmana.
We're in the middle of a fucking war.
Unfortunately for Ajay, his role as a legendary Mohan's son makes the Golden Path a birthright, and he does sympathize with their cause. It's also difficult to escape the conflict because it's all anyone or anything revolves around. Anytime you approach a radio tower, Pagan is giving announcements about the ongoing conflict, condemning the Golden Path and encouraging those still servient to stay as such. Driving around has Robbie Ron commenting about the latest resistance efforts. It's understandable that Ajay would be hesitant not just to help, but to risk his life too. Ajay, as far as we know, isn't a seasoned fighter, isn't accustomed to the horror, and yet within gameplay, this is reflected less so. There's always going to be a disconnect between the player and our avatar, because what's real for our avatar is fake for us. When Jason recoils at his first kill, that's because it's real and new for him. For the player, it's like, what, is this your first video game, pal? Fortunately, Far Cry 4 sidelines this transition narratively. Ajay is simply good with guns, and nobody seems to question it. The in-universe explanation is that he is ex-military, and truthfully, the reason doesn't matter. What matters is that, within this world, he is capable from the beginning of interacting with it at his fullest extent. The very first thing you could do is skin an animal in the tutorial. Because our character, and assumedly the player, are familiar with a dangerous world, Kyrat instead offers a fear of drowning in its history. I mentioned in my Watch Dogs 2 video that Ubisoft has always made exceptional open worlds, and one of the ways they achieve this is by giving those worlds a past to contextualize the present. I care about how a location is just as much as I care about how it got there, and Kyrat has its history on display literally and figuratively, as the many missions detailing its mythical past offer unique gameplay quirks to more or less force us to be interested. I find this land's past to be much finer than the Rook Islands, not just because the story of the land is better, but because the manifestation is more overt. The Rook Islands had a few bunkers and letters. Kyrat has journals, statues, monuments, traditions that lived on, and even whole missions that delve into its mythology. That does a lot to create an intimate connection with the location. Where Far Cry 4 can struggle the most is in direct contrast to its previous entries. Far Cry 2 and 3 had a particular color scheme. 2 was very yellow, 3 was very green, and in 3's case, it allowed enemies who are red to stand out against the backdrop. This is the same case here, but Kyrat has a potential problem. It's got a lot of color. Despite this, enemies still pop out enough to not be lost in the sea of saturation, and at times, it's a good thing they eventually wear mostly black. But when we get to the Himalayas, there's a new problem. The enemies are wearing white. Notice anything about the environment? Yeah, they aren't the easiest to see. However, their face coverings are also red, so at times all I could see was the red, and when I'm trying to do things incognito, having the equivalent of a neon sign pointing at their weak point was helpful. Said Himalayan missions were a fun change of pace the first few times, but by the end of the campaign I found myself increasingly tired of them, strictly because it takes away some of the best parts of Kyrat. Color? Gone. Nature? Minimized. Visibility? Try a vignette in a snowstorm. But most damaging? Mobility. Hindered. Often, these trips see you being funneled either by large doors or by the mountain paths. Part of the joy I found from tackling outposts, which most of the Himalayas consist of, is approaching it from land, sea, or sky, and using elevation to scout ahead, plan ahead. This time, because we're pushed through a funnel, our ability to plan and execute is severely limited, resulting in a difficulty increase, which is good. Far Cry 4 becomes a cakewalk even faster than Far Cry 3, but it should get harder because there are more enemies, more alarms, and more complications, not through less freedom. If you're going to take away a tool, you need to allow other tools that the player would ideally feel inclined to use to be strengthened under this new scenario. The only time freedom should be restricted is to encourage the player to try a different strategy, and I don't believe the Himalayas achieve this. Fortunately, we don't spend much time there in the campaign or the side missions. Where most of your time will be spent is in taking back Kyrat. The gameplay, especially moment-to-moment mechanics, are exactly where the criticism of this just being Far Cry 3 again comes from. Do I think that criticism is wrong? I guess not entirely, but I also think we need to define what it would need to be to feel entirely new. Shooting feels cleaner, there's less overall jank, the radio towers and outposts are more difficult, and our sense of progression changes completely. These things make the game feel thematically different, but not mechanically different, because let's be real, it's a lot of the same. The game is at its best when under-equipped, yet a power fantasy is only ever as far as the nearest flamethrower. A difficult early game will force players to engage with mechanics and crafting, but all of it can be disregarded the moment you acquire your first silenced weapon. There's a problem with this statement though, as clearly, I gravitated towards those silenced weapons, so I feel the need to identify that I am simply presenting this dynamic to you, not praising or condemning it. Far Cry 4, like 3 before it, leaves the difficulty up to the player. However, the means of making the game easier is abundantly available from the beginning. Plenty of games have difficulty settings or sliders, but they fail to factor in a simple issue with humans. Ego. I don't care how hard your game is, I am not turning that difficulty to easy mode. My mom did not raise a bitch, and I would often take the more difficult challenge that I may even enjoy less, because at least I'll have the satisfaction in knowing I did it. Most games have these settings, but within gameplay also include certain mechanics, weapons, or strategies to make the game easier. The reason some items like this exist, let's say for example the boosters, is because it allows the player to feel as though their planning and strategy was what got them through the difficult challenge. I'm sorry, but if you grabbed a few crafting materials and made a booster that makes you take less damage, and that's what you needed to get past an encounter, then you essentially crafted an item that puts the game on easy mode for a few minutes until you get past whatever you were stuck on. We see similar discussions in regards to Dark Souls, a series curiously without an official easy mode. Instead, people call certain classes of characters, playstyles, mechanics, easy mode, because that is essentially what it is. It makes the game easier. But these discussions become a slippery slope, because where do we distinguish between something in a game designed to be fun, or to be an alternative playstyle, and something directly meant to help the player succeed? If summoning an NPC is playing the game on easy mode in spite of the boss having more health to compensate, then surely Titanite, a material used to only boost the amount of damage your weapons do, is also easy mode. Surely upgrading your health makes the game easier, so is that too in easy mode? Most would say no, because those are clearly tools the player is meant to engage with. In linear games like Dark Souls, we could run in circles talking about it, but in open worlds, the conversation changes a bit. To keep with the Souls formula, we can look at Elden Ring. Smithing stones, like Titanite, are designed to purely boost the damage weapons do, make the game easier. If Margit, the first boss, is hard, you can walk around, explore, and upgrade your weapon. But you can also explore so far that you attain enough upgrade materials to make that fight, and many subsequent fights, a cakewalk. It's easier to say that we are meant to engage with those upgrades, but with an open world game, the new question is, to what extent are we to engage with it, and at what point? A silent sniper and pistol are easy to come across early on and trivialize almost every outpost. Does that make the game too easy? Am I meant to cruise through the main quests because the first chance I had, I decided to farm skill points and make Ajay a powerhouse for the next mission that expects us to still be in the beginning of our journey? What this side tangent aimed to do is explain that yes, there are some things I feel are overpowered and some underpowered, but just because there is an option to make it harder or easier does not mean I want to take it. Yes, the silenced weapons make the game significantly easier, but for me, it was also much more fun than not using them, and more fun than using the bow, which to me was too unreliable. Just because the game is harder under certain circumstances doesn't mean those circumstances are fun. We see this most clearly with things like aiming and accuracy. If we want to make shots harder to hit, we can make the guns less accurate. But that isn't a fun challenge to me because it creates a barrier between what I want to do and what the game will allow me to do that doesn't need to be there. Regardless, the fun of Far Cry 4, more than 3, was the power fantasy and not simply completing the objective, but doing it in the way I wanted. Maybe I wanted to bust in guns blazing, taking down choppers with either a well-placed shot or a grenade. Maybe I wanted to approach the base with nothing but a knife, a pair of binoculars, and a dream. If we wanted to nullify criticisms of the game being too easy, then a solid argument is that efficiency isn't the point, it's just an option. If you enjoy min-maxing, doing things as efficiently as possible, and having the game's balance crumble before you, then that is an option. For as much as I enjoyed that, I also enjoyed doing a bare-bones run. These playstyles were valid in Far Cry 3, but their legitimacy is heightened in Far Cry 4 because the gunplay is tighter and you can do it with a friend. Every single outpost in Far Cry 4 can be done in co-op, and this elevated the fun of the experience to a whole new level. Genuinely, and I know this is not exclusive to Far Cry 4, but playing with a friend, coordinating attacks, and deciding how we wanted to approach was so much fun.
Almost lost altitude there.
I just did a loop! Oh my god! Oh fuck. I actually want to walk you through one of the encounters because it was genuinely one of the greatest gaming moments I have ever experienced, and I would be kicking myself if I didn't share it. On top of the outposts around the map, there are also 4 fortresses. These fortresses have increased enemy numbers and are much larger than your usual outposts, but all of them are heavily reinforced unless you complete certain campaign missions that weaken them in the process. These unweakened fortresses offer the greatest challenge, well tuned for cooperative play. I was fortunate enough to have a friend to play with, and as we scoped out the area, we came across the first challenge. Every base has alarms. Once rung, reinforcements will show up to the camp, and these reinforcements make life very difficult for you, and being spotted or having an alarm pulled means that you lose out on a bonus. Often you can shoot these alarms with a well-placed sniper shot, but on this particular base, the alarms were in hard-to-reach places, leaving a sniper ineffective. Our plan was have one person on the inside, moving through the different buildings and getting recon from the other person positioned on a cliff facing the fortress. Once the alarms were dealt with, it was free reign to take the base. It took communication, on-the-fly planning, and a little bit of luck, but once we were in the base, things were looking good. I didn't know how to get up to the roof, so my partner was able to guide me along to the first alarm and second alarm, nearly being spotted along the way.
You can air assassinate. Oh no, he's going into the house. He's directly below you. He's where you just were. You can air assassinate him now. Nice, beautiful.
Once the first 2 were done, we set our sights on the furthest, hardest alarm, as the other alarm was reachable by sniper, but maneuvering to that harder alarm was going to be a challenge. We decided I would walk along the outside wall and take down the heavy guards surveying the area. This needed to be done by hand because heavy gunners can only be taken down silently with a melee attack. We had just one more heavy standing between us and the most difficult alarm, and once he went down, so did the last 2 alarms. Now we just needed to eliminate everyone to capture the base, but in my excitement, I foolishly got greedy and missed an easy sniper shot, leading me to almost get spotted. After narrowly escaping thanks to some excellent cover fire, there was one enemy left, and once he went down, we got confirmation that not only did we finish the base without raising alarms, but without being detected at all. Dude, that was fucking crazy.
That was a better Ghost Recon experience than the times we played Ghost Recon.
We could literally submit that as like a fucking E3 trailer.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
This kind of on-the-fly coordination, cooperation, and decision-making in order to conquer an insurmountable goal is the exact dream Ubisoft is selling with these games. It is Far Cry 4 at its absolute best, and truthfully, it's one of the best runs of something like this in any co-op game I've ever played. But this is only possible because of the refined mechanics of Far Cry 4. Yes, the concepts necessary for this to work were present in Far Cry 3, but they aren't polished enough to make the game constantly complicated, yet fair. The detection time strikes a perfect balance, and it's an added bonus that the guards will react if they find a body, causing them to act irrationally. It's best to keep them from spotting dead bodies as it maintains control, and often, when I discuss systems like this, there is a caveat of when these systems work, but these systems don't need that caveat, because they almost always worked. That's not to say everything is perfect, but at least when it comes to stealth, it's what I stuck to the most because it was the most consistent. Open combat has a bunch of minor issues that don't matter, like hit detection being weird on certain guns, but I want to discuss the major issues because they plagued certain parts of the game. For one, don't bother buying a scope for any weapon that isn't a sniper rifle because it, regardless of aim, is inaccurate. There were plenty of moments where shots would just miraculously miss. I don't mind inaccuracies on certain guns, especially when snipers here were always deadly accurate, but I just wonder why they offer 2 scopes for a weapon that serves no benefit. Another issue is when taking damage from both melee and fire damage. Taking damage from fire is a pain because it begins in animation and damage, but is put out by pressing the heal button. But that opportunity to put out the fire is delayed, meaning you often heal, are interrupted by the burning healing animation, have to put out the fire, and are then allowed to heal. This contradicts our instinct, which is to put the fire out right away. When close to enemies, they'll do a melee attack that, despite not looking powerful, knocks Ajay flat on his ass and leaves him not just open to a storm of bullets as he spends ages getting back up, but can also be reinitiated if the enemy doesn't back up. Enemies won't stop themselves from getting close to you, so in some cases, if I was spotted because I rounded a corner and an enemy saw me and decided to knock me down, I was often dead right away. While we're on the topic of near game ruining issues, let's talk about the wingsuit, which this time is unlocked early on. I think the introduction of the wingsuit so early into the game is a poor decision because it takes away the player's ability to embrace the world. Ubisoft's worlds are never best approached from above, but from the ground. They design everything from the dirt to the trees so well, and yet with the wingsuit, we're allowed to miss so much of it. I understand why it's here. It was a fun addition to Far Cry 3, but I think the significance of the wingsuit was missed, and thus is incorrectly recreated here. The wingsuit is a fun means of traversal because of what it represents. Power over a land now conquered. Jason's entire journey, and the natural journey of any Far Cry player, is to show up in an unfamiliar world and begin at the ground, using only the weapons you find, barely scraping by most encounters. But eventually, you become strong enough to conquer it all, and once you have, through a trial by fire, claim the crown of this land, can you coast above it? Because thematically, you are above it. By allowing us the wingsuit so early, we skip that step. Ajay, a normal person, immediately ascends to the superhuman heights of Jason, someone who needed a supernatural Tatao to perform the feats he did. This may be blowing it out of proportion, but truly, Far Cry 3's ability to so closely link its gameplay to its story is why the game is more than a story. It's a journey. Far Cry 4 has a story, and while it's good, it misses an integral step. We can also see the wingsuit as a wise ability to give the player near the end of the game for collectible cleanup reasons, but the real issue here is how it comes out. The wingsuit opens with Shift or L3, which is also the sprint button. If you played this game on controller, then congratulations, you have not experienced this issue, because in order to activate the wingsuit, you need to press the button again. But on keyboard, it takes the held input as you wanting to open the wingsuit. This means basic platforming is turned into a chore, as you will frequently jump off and immediately open your wingsuit, causing death or a massive inconvenience. Except for this one time where it was a pretty cool skip, but otherwise, this sucked ass, and I wish it could have been tweaked so that you simply tap the button again to open it, and the game ignored your previously held input. It's not often that I would jump off a steep surface without sprinting beforehand, so it happened all the time. New enemy types make an appearance here, most notably the hunters, which will not show a detection bar if you're in their sights, and alert the rest of the base by whistling. Also, they can only be marked for a second or two. These enemies on paper sound really good. In motion, they kind of fucking sucked. The whole point of the binoculars is to streamline the stealth process. The whole point of the detection meter is to make the game more forgiving on players, especially when without it, there would be a tedious amount of trial and error. Having enemies that ignore the quality of life features for the player just makes them a tad annoying. These enemies thankfully stopped showing up as much in the later half of the game, and I am very grateful for it. Otherwise, gameplay here is as it was before, but the setting and excuses for that gameplay to occur were stronger. The biggest mistake Far Cry 4 makes is that its opening act after you escape from Min's fortress is painfully slow. It takes its time showing you the ropes, and while it lets you loose early, I would say I wasn't fully invested in the story until we were introduced to Noor. Her character was the first to immediately grip me narratively, and her missions offered an excuse to engage in the arena, as well as being a turning point where the story starts moving faster. Missions like those where you take over a drug operation but end up inhaling some of the fumes were pure highlights. The colors, the music, everything from this scene was gold. At first, I was skeptical that the missions here would top Far Cry 3, and personally, it doesn't reach the same heights, but the consistency alone is commendable. Where Far Cry 4 clears its predecessor though is in the side content. There are still races, assassinations, big game hunts, but there's also an arena, some drug trip side quests, and some that see you traveling to Shangri-La. And these missions for their variety alone were good, but the quality left some to be desired. Traveling to Shangri-La was not just a fun aesthetic change of pace, but the bare bones playstyle meshed surprisingly well with the rest of the game, especially when, by the time you're introduced to these missions, you have a small military arsenal keystered at all times. It almost felt like a precursor to Far Cry Primal, a game that was so immersive in its prehistoric setting that I actually felt myself becoming a caveman when playing it because it was so fucking mind-numbing, but we're getting off track. The boss fight that ends this quest was fun too, but the boss being able to effectively one-shot you if you took a second to take down an enemy was a tad annoying. I didn't expect the Shangri-La missions to be so good, but I certainly expected more from Yogi and Reggie's stunts. You run into these fellas after returning to Mohan Ghali's home, and they end up drugging you on more than a few occasions. These trips usually see you spending time in the open world with disappearing enemies, and without your weapons, meaning you need to scrounge around for guns and a means of defense. The first time you trip, it'll be within the campaign, and it'll be a lot of fun, but the missions to follow aren't the best. Sure, traversing the open world in search of your gear is fun when the bright colors and funky music are playing, but once that veneer wears off, it becomes a tad boring. When the game implies that we'll be flying, I had hoped that it would be in reference to the wingsuit. Maybe its properties would be tweaked like in Shangri-La, but no, it just means that we use a helicopter and avoid some easy obstacles. Otherwise, the side missions here are quite run-of-the-mill, and thus I don't feel inclined to talk about all of them. I do think they are deeper than those of Far Cry 3, as they are often given out by an actual character and do feel more structured, but they never surprised me much. I will also admit that as far as side content goes, there isn't the same thematic presence as Far Cry 3, but the trade-off is that there is significantly more to do, and that content is more fun. In a series like Far Cry, missions don't need to be an epic set piece, because the dynamic world it's all set in is good enough that if the game simply asks me to take out a convoy, I'll do it and naturally get into hijinks along the way. For as much as I enjoyed where the set pieces went, the stories I always remembered were the ones I wrote. Pulling up on the aforementioned convoy and realizing that I was never going to make it by shooting at them, to then try a Molotov instead was so memorable because it was Far Cry at its most immersive. That moment of, oh shit, I need to figure this out fast. I only have these resources and I'm being shot at. I need a plan. Fortunately, the story that is here, if a little bare at times, was worth its admittedly slow start. I think the story of Far Cry 4 is where it's most like its predecessor, and unfortunately, the game's attempts at remaking the Rook Island's success is what brings the story down the most. This is not to say that it's Far Cry 3 again, but that, at least to me, Far Cry 4 creates its own identity in the beginning and holds that identity, but then at the very end, it almost felt as though the game attempted to remind us of the themes of Far Cry 3 in hopes that we would apply it to 4. I want to begin with Pagan, because while he is not Voss and would never be Voss, players are naturally going to look to him as Voss. We never did get enough of Voss, and this character is clearly insane, so it makes sense to project our desires onto him. But I believe the game starts so strongly because it hammers home that this is a new villain, and the difference is humanity. Pagan is constantly shown to be a pretty normal guy. He even expresses his fondness of Kanye West, which in 2014 made him very likable, and yet these days just makes him seem like more of a villain.
Let's see how much Kanye is going for. Do you follow him on Twitter? He is gold. Oh, I would love to shoot the breeze with that young man.
Regardless, he feels things, regret, embarrassment, anger, which Voss felt too, but where Voss seemed as though this mask of a horrific man was glued to his face, Pagan appears as though, after his trauma, that mask slipped, revealing the same thing that was inside Jason Brody, the desire to exert power and do what you please. Except, I believe Pagan's become bored. Pagan's plan is to give Ajay control of Kyrat while he goes on continuing to do what he really wants, which is never completely described. It's inferred that Pagan just wants to blow shit up, as juvenile as it might seem. Pagan is immature, he desperately wants the love of Kyrat, and he can't have it, so I believe part of that reaction is to burn it all down. The real Pagan, the one that was created by Mohan Ghale's actions, if we want to be charitable, desires love, and is stuck between desperately wanting it superficially from the people of Kyrat, yet being too closed off because if another Ishwari were to come along, who's to say she won't also be taken from him? I think this revelation, one made too late into the game's story, makes Pagan more interesting than Voss. It also helps that Pagan is present. He's constantly talking to you over the radio, and even has a few in-person appearances. In all of them, he's shown to be understanding towards Ajay, which makes him not immediately killing you believable. He wants you to see him as family. Yes, his screen presence is nowhere near as electric as Michael Mando, but the actual story of how someone becomes like him is more fleshed out, and builds upon the themes of Far Cry 3 in significant ways, as any sequel should. Jason was changed by the island. His ego was fed, and he did what he needed to do in order to survive and save his friends. Ajay has a far flimsier excuse of simply spreading his mother's ashes. The letter he keeps with him, the jar of his mother, according to Pagan, are simply an excuse to do what he wants. This might answer a large criticism of the story, which is Ajay's flip-flopping between not wanting to be involved with the Golden Path and ultimately jumping at the chance to risk his life in their honor. It calls into question his motivation, our motivation. Do we really care about the Golden Path? Do we actually value the lives of the people of Kyrat? Or do we simply use their struggle as an excuse to do what we want? To kill, to blow shit up. This is a theme relatively unexplored in Far Cry 3. Was there a point where Jason needing to save his friends was used as an excuse to keep his rampage going? Hell, the player probably forgot about Lakshmana halfway through the game, and if you kill Pagan, then Ajay even admits that he doesn't really give a shit. Far Cry 4 in this way is a continuation of Far Cry 3's critique of the player, but there is a small problem that is more evident now, which is our awareness that it's a game. We, as the player, know this is a video game and are reminded of it at every turn. It's true that we likely don't care about the golden path, and that's for two reasons. One, the player knows they aren't real, and two, they don't care about us either. Amita and Sabal rarely show concern for anything outside of whatever their mission is. If we kill civilians, we face minimal repercussions, and I personally felt zero connection to the people and land of Kyrat. I want to explore this connection because not caring about the location's prosperity is exactly why I don't connect with its world, and that's because it's at odds with the player's fun. So, assuming you purchase the game based on the trailers, you are here in Kyrat to shoot things. If the golden path wins, you don't get to do that anymore. I don't want to help that much because while driving out Pagan's forces, I am also driving out my sources of fun. Maybe it's selfish to think that, but I know these people aren't real, so why does it matter? So yes, in terms of Ajay, spreading his mother's ashes is an excuse for him to do all of these wild things, but for the player, they don't need an excuse. I mentioned this in my GTA 5 video, but people will still load up Grand Theft Auto just to drive around doing what they like. This is a valid critique of Ajay's actions, but when Pagan looks at the camera like this, he's looking at the player, and unfortunately, even if the game were to give me the objective of blowing up an animal hospital, I'd be strapping C4 to an elephant and riding through the front door, grinning ear to ear. I'm not doing these things because I just can't get enough and I need an excuse. Most of the time, I'm just doing it because you asked nicely, and I was rewarded handsomely. When we are rewarded with experience, money, and unlocks, we have ulterior motives. On one hand, it could mean that we, Ajay, are doing these things because we want to exert power, unlock upgrades that make us more powerful and more efficient, thus strengthening Pagan's critique. Conversely, this creates a greater disconnect because, due to the external influences, we might be performing actions we didn't want to. I never enjoyed hunting, but because I needed upgrades to my weapon holsters, I gladly did it. That's not me using the objective as an excuse to have fun, that's me using the gameplay, the fun, as a means to an end. But where I think Pagan's argument is best applied to is himself. Pagan lived as Jason did. He did what he wanted, and eventually conquered an entire country. But what happens when that's finished? Once Jason is crowned king by climbing a mountain of conquered corpses, what's left? Pagan feels like an answer, or at least a possibility. I realize that a lot of time is being spent unpacking this, but the truth is, that's where the meat of Pagan's character lies. Sure, he has a detailed history and is actually present, but this ending segment is the most we see from Pagan ideologically. And I think his contrast to Voss, one that paints the same story of a man turned insane by the land he inhabits, but from a different angle, is well done. Though I wasn't a fan of Kyrat itself being the cause of this change. Throughout the game, most notably in the letters left by Yuma or Ajay's mom, addressed to either Pagan or Ajay, the game lightly pushes this idea that the land itself changes people, and turns them into monsters like Pagan. This was a significant theme in Far Cry 3, but there's a major difference: order and civilization. The Rook Islands were remote. The order there was of drug lords and ancient tribes. What made the people mad there was being drenched in savagery. They had nothing, their homes were made from scrap, and their means of survival always included the death of another. Kyrat has a history, it's a real place, and its people more than anything just want peace. For as much as Amita and Sabal are at each other's throats, it's never directly a fight for power over Kyrat. It's over a shared desire to see Kyrat prosper. I think instead there's an argument to be made that Pagan and his army is the cause of Kyrat's corruption. Sabal and Amita are some of the best characters in the game for two reasons. One, they illustrate the political and moral implications of a rebellion, and two, they both make solid cases. Every handful of missions ends in a fork, where there is a direct problem and you can choose to side with either Amita or Sabal, and whoever you side with will be the one leading the golden path until the next fork. Generally, Amita wants to sacrifice the past and morals in order to secure the future, whereas Sabal values maintaining Kyrat's history and morality, even if that makes the fight harder. The conflict is presented well, and on every occasion I found myself heavily weighing what I would choose. Sure, Amita is right, we would need to sacrifice tradition in order to not be broke once all of this is over, but then again, if Kyrat survives this rebellion, but its history, its culture, and a significant amount of its population are lost in the process, did Kyrat really survive? The greatest issue with the pair is that by the end of the game especially, they are both given a moment of radicalization to make players rethink their decisions. Amita will enslave the youth of Kyrat, training them to work in drug fields and deploy them as soldiers. Sabal will slaughter anyone who supported Amita. Amita will ask you to kill Sabal. Sabal will ask you to do the same if you side with him. But do you know what the problem is? These radical revelations that would heavily make one reconsider who they're supporting is shown after the player makes the final choice to keep them in power. I think the decision to choose who will be the permanent leader would be better if given after their true colors are shown. I get it, there are radicals on both sides, and I'm not saying we need a third option to do neither. In fact, I sort of like being forced to choose, but I don't appreciate getting a decision to do something that is generally reasonable, only to then have those people go on to be fucking animals and the game preach that choices have consequences. Seriously, how was I supposed to know that the guy who was preaching morals for the entire game would turn around and start slaughtering people? I'm okay with the game preaching this, but at least make the player feel reasonably responsible for it. I also want to see more of an impact. Often when you please one of the Golden Path leaders, they'll say, look at the difference you've made, and it's the same as it ever was. Maybe that's the point, to see the futile nature in all of this, but I don't buy it. Maybe by seeing the change in the world, we could actually feel the doubt the game is so desperately wanting from us. There was one moment where I thought, have I made the right choice? And it was during the final 10 minutes of the game. Once Pagan's fortress is claimed, there's an oddly peaceful drive up to Pagan's palace. On the way up, we see statues destroyed, the culture of Kyrat in shambles. I thought to myself, that's a bit tragic. And then it immediately dawned on me, fuck. That's what Amita's going to do. Sure, she'll be doing it in service of the country's longevity, but is that really worth it? As much as I appreciated being able to do this, again, I thought, why couldn't this revelation be made before the point of no return? Who knows, maybe I was too dense to see it foreshadowed. When these two protagonists are the primary characters for most of the story and they end up like this, it makes me feel as though the game has an extremely cynical outlook on politics as a whole, and it almost feels like a cop-out. If the game doesn't want to pick sides, fine. But to say both are bad feels like the game lacks the balls to say anything more daring than colonialism bad, which, yeah, no shit. It's especially tragic when we look at how this game portrays Pagan's rule, which is disconnected from his character. Pagan the person has a heart, even if it is corroded. Pagan the figure is ruthless, paranoid, and calm. I could appreciate the contrast between the two, as the player comes to like Pagan, maybe not in the same way Ishwari did, but enough for us to almost feel bad for him. Unlike Far Cry 3, I think the third act, signified by storming the north, is where the game is at its best, even if that road has a few potholes. Missions in the Himalayas were feast or famine in terms of fun and balance, whereas the story gets sidetracked from Pagan for a while to focus on Noor. Noor runs the arena in Kyrat, and while she doesn't want to, she does so because Pagan's lieutenant Paul has her children. We learn a fair amount of how she hates what she does, but also feels she needs to because she can't abandon her children. When we track Paul down and interrogate him, we find out that her children had been dead for years, and that the letters Noor had been reading were fake. It's a shockingly brutal torture that hits all the harder when Noor, regardless of what you choose, dies. She can't be saved, and maybe she doesn't deserve to be. Also, fun detail, I love that Ajay pushes Paul's hands in the trunk before driving away. It's such a small detail that honestly made me laugh. This was an engaging side plot, but it did feel a little sidetracked. The same is true for Yuma. When looking at Far Cry 5, we see a pattern that future games would follow, which is dismantling a part of the Big Bad's operation before taking them on directly. This is presented here. Pagan's closest allies, Paul and Yuma, need to be dealt with before Pagan himself goes down, and this formula was expanded upon with the Seed family. I think it could be argued that this is present in Far Cry 3, as Buck and Voss need to be killed before moving on to Hoyt, but I would argue that is less taking down your target's support system and more working your way up the food chain. The roots of this formula, to me, are sown in Kyrat, but it isn't explicitly shown this way. Instead, it's more of a convenience, something to do before you storm Min's castle. Fortunately, it's not that simple. As with Yuma especially, we get a glimpse into what Pagan was like before Ishwari, and the resentment she feels towards the new Pagan added depth to both her and Min. It helps that both of her encounters are drug-fueled, and we even get a similar shortness of breath from Ajay as we saw with Jason, where once they sober up from their encounter, they see the bodies left in their wake. I wasn't sure how to interpret Ajay's breathing here. Was it a realization of how powerful he is? Was he shocked at what he'd done? Or was it simply being in such a close encounter? I wonder if it's the first, because it's by this point in the story the game really hammers home the idea that Kyrat as the location is changing the player. And I apologize for coming back to this theme so much, but I truly don't believe it lands that well, and I'm desperate to understand it enough to enjoy it. If we want help unpacking the story, then we can look at Far Cry 6's DLC, Pagan Control. This DLC, like the Voss Insanity expansion before it, takes the subtlety of the game it's based on and essentially shoves its themes down your throat. I won't bother with the gameplay, but story-wise, it confirms the dichotomy between Pagan Min's normal, pure heart and the tyrant, his more ruthless shadow. I don't want this to be confused with some kind of dissociative identity disorder, because I don't think that's what's happening, but rather, I think Min's other half is one born out of guilt. Not necessarily for hurting people, both sides of him are more than comfortable with that, but out of seeing his loved ones hurt by his actions. We can infer that based on his thoughts, what he really wants is a family, and since he can't have them, he might as well be indulging in his short-term desires. Maybe the thoughts of what he lost boss could be drowned out by gunfire and explosions. Ultimately, the story of Far Cry 4 was an interesting one. Whenever one facet of the story is lacking, another plot thread comes along to pick up the slack, and while it doesn't reach the same highs of 3, it also doesn't reach the same lows. The northern part of Kyrat is where the game gets better, unlike 3, where the south feels like a strange epilogue, where the game doesn't really know what to do without Voss. In our case, if the Golden Path wasn't doing it for me, then figuring out what happened to Ajay's mother and father, and where or rather who Lakshmana is, kept me engaged. I think it properly builds upon the themes of Far Cry 3 while feeling like its own product, and that's important when your biggest criticism is supposedly making the same game over and over again. So, here we are. The first game to be labeled Far Cry 3 again. I mentioned at the end of my Far Cry 3 video that to call the future entries a copy of Far Cry 3 would be disrespectful to Far Cry 3's legacy, because the game has still yet to be properly iterated upon. There is no game like Far Cry 3, and much of my argument in this video has been not about whether Far Cry 4 is better, but if it's different enough. It's true, this game doesn't always feel like a successor to Far Cry 3, in fact, sometimes it feels like a bastard inheritor, but it instead feels like an offshoot. It maintains some themes but does something original, which to me is a harder balance to strike. Doing Far Cry 3's story again would be significantly easier than taking us to a whole new aesthetically new location, giving us a new villain that opposes the previous villain, and creating a whole new arc for our character. The gameplay of Far Cry 4 is stronger than 3, its mechanics are tighter, and to help with the added level of control are harder enemies and more challenging layouts for the outposts, which can now be tackled in co-op. Couple this with a world that contains so much vibrance, beauty, and culture that I found myself getting lost in it over and over. It's true, Jason's arc can't be recreated, but at least the game allows you to get those near essential weapons and skills early, allowing those who played Far Cry 3 to not feel as though they are starting from zero again. Yes, the story isn't as tight, I will concede that, but I believe that in every other facet, Far Cry 4 is not just a worthy sequel, but a better game. It's unfortunate that Far Cry was labeled as making the same game over and over again. It's something that happens to a lot of games in a series. Call of Duty with each entry introduces so many new mechanics, but the people who haven't played it in a decade insist it's the same game each year. Better yet, when those games change, they beg for things to go back to the way it was. Assassin's Creed, a small indie series, had a consistent string of games that were received well, completely different. I mean, we went from the Italian Renaissance to the American Revolution with a complete traversal overhaul, to then the Caribbean as a pirate with some of the best naval combat of the generation, and still, people complained it was the same. I don't need to explain what happened when Ubisoft listened and changed the series. We've heard it before. So yes, the series has maintained a consistent theme, and yes, at its core, things haven't changed much. But why does that need to be an issue? Let Far Cry keep being Far Cry. Don't engage with the game at a surface level and then criticize it for not changing enough, because we've done that before and it turned out horribly. To do the same thing over and over, expecting shit to change, that would be exceptionally unwise. I mean, God, have we not learned our fucking lessons, guys? Like, seriously, like, yeah, it would be crazy, like, totally insane, but it would also be really, really stupid. Hey everyone, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, you can leave a like and subscribe, and if you really enjoyed it, you can support me on Patreon. And if you are supporting me on Patreon, then your name's on screen right now, and you probably saw this video early. I had a lot of fun making this video. It was definitely one of the harder videos to write. It was really difficult kind of collecting my thoughts on this game, but I think it turned out okay. I definitely want to cover the rest of the Far Cry series, so hopefully this video does well. And yeah, I'm just going to, I kind of want to get back to work on finishing a bunch of other videos so that we can finish out the year right. So hope you guys are all doing well. Happy holiday season. Have a good rest of your year, and take care.